This is the nameless protagonist. Let's see. I don't think I see too many people in the chat just yet. So we'll give this a minute before we kick off here. Got a few. JB Designs Os. Prince Zakaria Os. Adric Os. Press someone in the chat if you can hear me okay. Okay, good. So it's streaming correctly. That was the concern. Okay. So we will get started now then. We've got a couple people here. Okay, cool. Firstly, I want to appreciate you guys for showing up. This will be the second installment with this idea of transpersonal psychology, humanistic psychology, what some people call the fourth force. And today's general topic is going to be on purpose and meaning, as well as this concept of Ikigai that comes out of Okinawa. But we'll go ahead and formally open the dojo, and then we'll bring in our guest and get everything started. Firstly, to the founders of the space, Wos. To those that are listening in the playback and who have joined here today, Wos. This is the nameless protagonist. I'd like to thank you for your time. We will be going over what I believe is a very important critical aspect of dealing with some of these changes that will be brought about by way of the fourth industrial revolution, and taking time to reverse engineer many of the things that have been left behind for the sake of progress, starting in the first industrial revolution, which took place in the late 19th century and early 20th century, to go back and sort of readdress and reacquire those things that really make us human. And for many of us, this idea of disappearing into the shadow of the mean, or the mean of the shadow, this average individual that is this hustler, go-getter, participating meaningfully in society, oftentimes has to give things like personal understanding and identification a backseat. I don't mean identification in relation to some established idea that's already present, but a true integrated understanding of who you are as a person and what that means for you. In short, purpose. Without any ado, I want to bring in today's guest, Miss Maggie Thompson.
Hello, thank you for having me. Os.
Absolutely. So we wanted to kick off the tone a little bit so we can get a little bit of a undertone for everything for today. And you are welcome to follow up with whatever you see fit.
Okay. I think one of the things that I wanted to share a little bit more on was this idea of transpersonal psychology. Are you okay with me going into that a little bit? Okay.
Absolutely.
And especially where purpose and meaning goes to, like you and I were talking about, finding purpose and meaning in transpersonal psychology is fundamental. It's because there's a lot of, in transpersonal psychology, they talk a lot about soul integration or ego integration. And this is what I say a lot, if anybody's ever listened to me, that, health is about balance. It's not about getting rid of the negative or solely focusing on positive things, but about moving inward to find answers. We hear that phrase a lot, as above, so below. But the second part of that is as within, so without. So what transpersonal psychology really looks at is integrating all aspects of you, of yourself, and not disliking or trying to cut away any part of who you are, because they all have a purpose towards your purpose and towards your meaning. So in transpersonal psychology, a lot of what they talk about is soul's intention, which would be like purpose, right? Like
Mm.
what is your unique role in this sort of interconnected whole of reality? Like not what you do or what you can do for others, but what you're here to become. And then what
Mm.
are you doing to become that in the unfolding story that's around you? Because you're the main character, right? This is your story. And you can't make other people the main character in your own story. So, what is the soul's intention? And then meaning behind that being like, what is the symbolism of it? What is the spirituality of it? What is the interpretation of your soul's purpose? Like, how do you make sense of suffering, but also how do you make sense of joy? And how are all of these things synchronous as a part of your specific journey or your specific evolution towards transcendence, towards your greater purpose?
Yeah, and it sounds like you're describing a full integration of the self, not just from a macro, but a micro state. So it's this idea of moving away from these preset determining ideas that says aspects of your shadow or aspects that aren't a part of the collective shadow really are this evil that has to be purged. It is a actual response and in many instances tailored to particular ways you used to cope with reality. And oftentimes these things that are tools that can help you ascend are framed as demons holding you back. And if you can just reframe and reallocate your intellectual, I guess you could say, resources towards repurposing them to be of service to you, it could be the difference between you making a spiritual breakthrough as far as finding that context versus having it be something that constantly holds you back from where you could be.
Oh, I totally agree. One of my favorite sayings to say to people is, "Who told you that?" So, and that a lot of that has to go towards, and we hit on this last time, where I say that psychology, medicine, religion, they all tell us to hate ourselves. They tell us that we are dirty, that we're sex crazed, that we're imperfect or incomplete or ill or sinful or disgusting or and we're never really taught that a lot of the things about us that we have been told is wrong are actually right, are actually normal human responses, and they shouldn't have any connotation to them. They shouldn't be seen as inherently negative or inherently bad. One of the things I talked about was, when you're sick, because your body's been exposed to bacteria and you get a fever, and the first thing we're trying to do is bring down the fever. But your body is acting exactly how it's supposed to. That fever is actually helping you heal. And so, that's a lot of what I go into with that is, when people say things, it's like, well, who told you that? Because and the whole reason I ask who told you that is because then you have to consider, what do they have to gain by you thinking that about yourself?
Correct. And it's speaking to this implied handing over of autonomy that you may not have necessarily agreed to, not consciously, but you do so subconsciously by offering that, I guess you could say, consent to influence your perspective. Because there's this internal state that human beings find that they have. And it's kind of like this white room that can be tailored to your inner landscape. And everything that's there, some of these things are mailed to that inner space, and you either sign off on it or you don't. And oftentimes, there are many things that are there that came with the prepackaging of being a human being. But when you're being forced to exist in this environment that's all about outcomes and metrics and reducing human beings to the sum total of their productivity, it's very easy to see these extra things that are actually there to help you cope as baggage that's presenting or preventing you from being able to adapt to this template that's been presented to you. And oftentimes, the way you address that is introspection and having time to think about it. But if you never get the time to even do that, or if the software, the editing software you're offered, instantly frames anything outside of a particular mold as negative or less than, particularly this less than ideology, you never reach that point of being enough without enough being somehow demonized.
Right. And it's even demonized to try to be happy. And I think you have to think about too is that we do come with this. We're not born as the tabula rasa. We're not a blank slate when we're born. We come with some genetic material, we come with some generational material. But one of the things we have to look at kind of from the nurture standpoint, I suppose, is what script are we reading from? Because
Mm,
the interesting thing is when we're born, our parents are the first people to hand us a script and say, this is who you are, and this is what you believe, and this is what you're going to be, and this is how you behave. And they hand us this script, and it's very similar to their own. And a lot of that has to do with they were also handed a script, and it's very pervasive in the West. As a child, you're going to play an instrument, and you're going to play sports, and you'll do this and that, and all these things. But also, you're going to go to church, and you're going to go to public school, and you believe in God, and you defer to authority because the teacher knows more than you. And where we get into trouble is when people question the script that they were handed, because in the West, you're handed a script, and every sort of developmental milestone that you go through, you're handed a new script. And you'll meet other people who are reading from their script. This is what we do, and then this is how we behave, and this is how we act. And as what seems to be happening now is more and more people, there always have been people who are awakened to this fact, but it does seem that more and more people are kind of awakening to the fact that these scripts we were handed about who we are and how we behave and what we should value actually is inherently pretty illogical.
correct. Correct. And when you run the full script and take a look at its greater implications, you begin to see that what you've done is you've dissected a human being to again these sum total parts that they're never
Mhm.
designed to operate that way. Like you can't, especially when you apply frameworks like equality to all of this. Lung tissue and skin tissue are part of the same body, but the lung tissue and the skin tissue have a place in the bigger picture of things. So if you don't understand their connectivity to the bigger picture, if you don't have your understanding in the bigger narrative of not just yourself, but being born here with a purpose, for example, if, and I'm digressing slightly to kind of tie this into the bigger point here, we all have those stem cells that inform you epigenetically of where you're supposed to go. And this idea of where you're supposed to go isn't supposed to be something that says you are lesser than, go there. It's here's your role in this greater scheme of things. Here's how you can do what you do even better by having an understanding of all those things around you. Historically, when I look at other cultures, the way they deal with births and people that are being brought into the community, it's a community undertone of your existence, your arrival was anticipated, expected, and welcome. But what's happened over time is people who exist in the inverse to that, the majority of people being born now in the industrial first world are almost born as a happenstance, as an accident, unintended. And so your entire framework is starting from a compensatory piece where you're apologizing for being born. You don't have any goal that's presented towards you. The value system that you're handed is very compensatory in nature. You're not being introduced as a part of a greater whole. Instead, you are this reactionary expression that manifested spontaneously as a part of this family tree, of which you may not even know. So it's probably more accurate to say you're related. And the growing trend at this point is there's even people being brought into the world now where your lineage of relation isn't even consistent, where through paternity fraud and things like that, people are finding out family members aren't even really family. So what happens to human existence then when you begin so much of it in this cognitive, I don't want to say spiritual negative, but I think that ends up being an emerging consequence. You're stuck in this state of debt from the onset. So you don't have the time to ask those questions you brought up. You don't get the time to analyze the software that you came into the world with. If it's good enough, then there you go. And it's not until you start having problems no longer being able to cope that you start having time to really question and go through that introspection. And then that's where I'm pretty sure you as a therapist have had this experience, and many others. They finally take the time to sit down and realize there's stuff that they've left unprocessed from all the way back to before when they were a freaking toddler, damn near.
Always. It's always that way. And a lot of times people don't realize it, but it's for the exact reasons you're talking about, because for several generations now in the West, it's exactly what you just said when you said you're apologizing for being born, because even children who are wanted and planned for, I'm doing everything right. I get married and I have kids, but there's this sort of parents bonding with each other. Women are a bit worse than men on this one, but parents bond with each other by complaining about their children. And while it's while adults, try, I suppose, I'm going to give them a little credit for it to be private, I suppose, but most kids will have overheard things, but they also feel it. They feel, I mean, you think about that mother, the mothers who's like, I was pregnant with you for 10 months and then I was in labor for 4 days and you made my ankles fat. And, so now you owe me this and you owe me that. So when you come in with this soul debt, it's such dissonance, because you come in and you owe your parents for you being born, and it's such a state of discomfort for children, especially the world that we live in. There's so much pressure and stress and violence and all these things, that it is no wonder that we are continually on an increase of young teens committing suicide, because they come in already owing to a world they are told is terrible, in a body they're told is wrong, And then we say, well, you just read from your script the way we did, because if reading from the script is wrong, then we're wrong and we can't be wrong. So just read from the script like we did, work yourself to death, spit out a bunch of kids, and then the next generation will do the same and do the same and do the same. And so there's all this dissonance about, is there anything good in the world? Will anything good ever happen to me? You have all these people, searching for things. And I always say the dew on the leaf. The world is full of beauty, but we're told that the world is ugly and you're ugly and everything in it is bad. And the only way to be seen of any quality is in your purpose, in your utility and usefulness. And you as an individual get no wants.
So it's interesting. I think that I'm going to go slightly off tangent, but I want to stay in orbit of the topic, because you reminded me of the studying that I'm doing now with regard to the origins of empathy. And it relates to this concept of group selection. So everyone's familiar with natural selection, natural and sexual selection. These are aspects introduced through understanding evolution and the way genes are passed on. So an interesting phenomenon is group selection, where there's this interesting tendency, if you view human beings and social entities as a whole, we know ourselves do this, but you could almost look at humanity existing in this state of superposition as a superorganism. And you can point to natural phenomenon like swirl-ons and the way birds use electromagnetic, I don't want to call it orientation. It's through quantum physics that they can fly in flocks and make these dynamic moves that they do. You could say that there's a lot of that could potentially be explained through human behavior from that kind of lens. I'm saying that to say this: with group selection, interesting phenomenons begin to occur, where you made mention earlier of self-deletion. And I made an observation that oftentimes, even though external conditions may be poor, what I noticed, at least in men, because men seem to have a higher efficacy rate of self-deletion, whereas women make more attempts at it, dudes tend to follow through with it quite intentionally and quite consistently. One of the overlapping themes I observed is this belief that they are of hindrance to those around them. It isn't so much that they're a hindrance to themselves or there's things that they can't get access to, which is the popular narrative. The key seemed to be there's a belief that they were a problem or a burden to others. And from that perspective, that's where you begin to recognize the overlap that this has with group selection, where cell death oftentimes either gets directly applied or implied by a particular organism within the group or a cell that's marked as being potentially a burden for whatever reason, and to acquire or offer more resources potentially to the remaining cells, that lagging cell or entity will self-delete essentially. And it just seems so interesting seeing an overlapping echo with that principle there, tying into the greater conversation we're having. It looks as though the environment is set to where, for many people, they believe that they are a burden on others, and deading people with that, hopping out the womb, is causing far more harm than good, which leads to this justification narrative of, I have to validate my existence here by being of use, of service in some way, shape, or form, irrespective of my needs or even opportunities to be educated to do that.
I totally agree, because the term that's used in psychology, but it's a term everybody knows, is worthlessness, is feeling worthless, and we did have for a while, people were like, am I enough? If I'm not enough for you, it's that feeling of worth. And people will get depressed enough that it'll go from worthlessness to feeling like a burden. Their simple existence is a burden, even though they may be able to find worth, right? Because you'll have people who they'll feel like everybody's using them and still feel like a burden.
Yep.
So they have utility, but they are so miserable because all they do is for others. And so nobody is really, we're never told that our ability to draw breath is value. Our ability to relate to others, our ability to love or to see beauty or to create beauty or to laugh. We're never told that those things have inherent value. But then you go around asking people, are you happy? You know, oh, I met somebody. Oh, are you happy? What in this world, in where we live right now, even helps us to understand what being happy looks like, let alone what it feels like? Do any of you know anybody you could say that is truly happy?
I think that's the interesting part, because it's where I think English in particular falls short. It falls short for me subjectively, because there's concepts like emotions and feelings, and I draw sharp distinctions between the two, but I also acknowledge that they're related. So you can list happiness as an emotion, but the way that feels for people is going to largely be contextualized on how they experienced that growing up, even if they did. And you'd be surprised. Well, you wouldn't be. The average person would be surprised at how much that is autonomically repressed and rewired into negative polarities within their own psyche, which is absolutely mind-boggling.
Well, I totally agree with that, because even in psychology, well, let me give my little caveat about psychology. Psychoanalysis, in the way that we see it now, was created by some racist, misogynistic people. And psychology as a science, like a lot of sciences, operated on that. So there's inherent flaws in some of the things here and there. But I'm one of those people who questions it. So as an example, to go with what you were saying, is we're taught in psychology, and there is studies about this, that as humans, you cannot maintain happiness, the feeling of happiness. And I push back on that quite a bit, because we can maintain any other negative feeling. We can maintain feelings of worthlessness for a longer period of time. You can be alive for 20 years and feel worthless, pretty much every day. You can maintain feelings of guilt. You can maintain anger. You can maintain hate. You can on these feelings that are seen as negative feelings, but for some reason we're told we can't maintain joy. We can't maintain happiness. That the best we'll ever get is a feeling of life satisfaction, or an overarching feeling of accomplishment. But if you guys listen to those words that I just said, those all have to do, satisfaction and accomplishment all have to do with your output. And so even in psychology, they say the way to lead a happy life is to be in service to others. and is to a job well done, do the work. Those are what make you happy. Now, yes, it'll make you happy if you help other people. Not just, sporadically, let me help other people, but something that you're passionate about, that's part of your purpose and meaning. Yeah. But maintaining happiness supposedly is an impossibility. And I just don't agree with it.
I think that's where, again, I'm saying the English language falls short. So I would approximate, I'll enter in the realm of my subjective opinion. I recognize what you're talking about as positive and negative polarity with regard to the emotional charge.
Yeah.
So I define positive and negative by the means through which it sustains itself or is non-sustainable. So here's what I tend to recognize. Negative energy operates a lot like a black hole. So what it requires then is to consume energy from other sources, and then from that point transmute it into usefulness. And you've got different frequencies of negativity. Anger is one because it'll get you moving. It's still a lower frequency, but it's greater than apathy. It's greater than this desolate nothingness of despair. So to move, some will get angry. And that can in turn become a coping mechanism that's justified, because they'll tell you, well, channel your anger to insert objective and goal. And what's not talked about is the spiritual strain that puts on you, your tendency to wear out your autonomic nervous system by having these negative predispositions. What I'm saying is, on a biochemical level, it will throw you off balance inherently. The next highest phase ends up being things like pride. And so long as you see someone through which you can compare yourself to, say you're better than, that can serve as fuel. And there are other social constructs that are provided for you within the culture that permit it. These are all things that require a target to consume from. And in more esoteric circles, it can be likened to the way vampires operate. The inverse to that would be things that are self-generated, things that once you have done the work, you can maintain this energy indefinitely without requiring anything else from anything, which I think is less promoted by the culture. It's something I think is far more embedded in our nature to be that way. And I think the majority of us are ritualistically separated from that kind of energy. And over time, we have to relearn typically on how to get back into alignment of that self-generating solar modality of emotional being, a frequency I like to call gratitude and animated with joy, as you described. But you'll find that the locks to that are generally kept within, and they're conditioned reflexes to keep people from getting access to that, because people place if-then clauses to gain access to it when it actually is something you can tap into. The key is identifying what is it that's keeping you from your own power.
You just hit on two psychological theories there and explained them super well. The first one is motivation. So the theory of motivation is that it requires discomfort. And so a lot of the ways that we look at negative emotions, and I'm glad you explained it as polarities, because I forget to do that. Sometimes negative isn't always bad.
Correct.
It's the inverse of things. But those negative emotions create those feelings, which we can feel somatically, like in your body, like, chest pains or different things like that, upset stomach when you're nervous, so you can have somatic response, but you feel discomfort. And so negative emotions are supposed to motivate towards action. So if you feel guilty about something that you've done, it creates this discomfort to cause you to fix it, right? We are as human beings at a baseline, we are pleasure seekers, which means we're also risk avoiders and pain avoiders. So we do whatever we can to get rid of discomfort. The problem being is that, and I'll just use men as an example, but they're not the only people that this happens to, but men, for an example, are trained from the get-go that they're not really allowed to express emotions. You can feel them, but nobody really cares. Especially, weirdly enough, especially happy emotions. Um, Men are taught, you can't cry, but even more so, you can't giggle, you know? So so then what you learn is that emotion and feeling are things that have to be dealt with and destroyed. So instead of it channeling into action, men learn to compartmentalize and put things in these neat boxes and just shove them way, way down. And what I tell men a lot is, stoicism has its place, and if it comes to you innately, that's great. But if you utilize stoicism because you were trained that you're not allowed to show emotion, then you have all these neat boxes of pain that you shoved way down in there. And unfortunately, all boxes leak. And so you will have things leak out and pain leak out. And eventually you're going to shove that last box in there and it's just going to start popping things open. So I think if we can view these negative emotions as motivators, like you were talking, channeling those things into action, that's the quickest way to dissipate those, is to not compartmentalize, but to use these feeling states as motivation. You can do the same thing with the positive feeling states too, because all emotions are, and you feel in response to an emotion.
I agree.
All they are is information. That's it. It's the same as smelling something or seeing something or feeling something. You also have these internal radars or antennas, I guess I would say, where, to use a colloquial term, you can feel the vibe of a place, but we all have these antennas, and in our interactions with other people, we'll receive information that creates an emotional state that gives us a feeling in how to respond. So all it is information. And you have to use that information wisely instead of, like I said before, being told that you are inherently bad for crying or for giggling or for doing all these other things. So motivation was the first one. But the other one you were talking about is the succubi theory of psychology, where people are a succubus towards other people's emotional energy because they can't maintain their own. So they will transmute their dysfunctional emotional states through another person.
Either by invoking that emotion in someone else to elicit a feeling, or by withholding their own after they've gotten someone acclimated to it, which I guess leads down to a particular set of psychological diagnoses, or they could just be inherited methodologies from some people. But yeah, that's the direction I was going.
Yeah, I mean, I've treated several people who had a parent with a personality disorder, and they learned certain behaviors through that parent, and they do those things, but then they have a lot of guilt about it, or they feel like it shouldn't be that way, or these things. And then you have to work with them on, this wasn't a you thing. Like this is not something that's inherent to you. This was something that you learned. And it kind of goes back to the who told you that kind of thing. And do they benefit from you behaving a certain way? You know, most kids of parents with personality disorders have a very deep feeling of that they have to overcome, that that they were already given this life's purpose of overcome. And
Mm.
and that's a lot of pressure on children, but it's a lot of pressure on human beings that your whole purpose is to overcome. And some people take on way too much just to prove that they're worthy of their parents' love and respect.
Yeah, something that should be automatic and intrinsic ends up being this conditional modality that, because I'm all for struggle. The key is give them the tools, present these things under the animating energy of trust. Otherwise, it's destructive. And I think that's the ingredient oftentimes that's missing, where the trust is one dimensional, or people have been imprinted with this idea of becoming a commodity in service to the parents because the parents view the children as the property we were describing earlier. So
Mhm.
it ends up denaturing these aspects of challenges where you'll get two different extremes where one, there's this constant denial, or rather, let me go to the orthodox method. There's this constant state of performative do for me. And if you do, then you get that. And it's from a very self-oriented modality where the parents are projecting their damage onto their children ritualistically to justify the fact that they went through it because they haven't reconciled it with themselves, they being the parents. Then you've got the inverse reaction to that, where there's this denial and withholding of things, irrespectively. So you get these two forms of burns that you can get, one from fire and the other one from ice, which I guess it comes down the line, when you start looking at tools that can help people, one is going to require the very thing that's harmful to the other to actually address, because all those burns look the same until it's time to treat them. So when you can understand that this is part of a greater issue, where in the effort to become part of this shadow of the mean, this average individual consumer profile, you could say, that aligning yourself with these constants, these concepts have dehumanized you from who you are, and you're not being given the tools required to cope with reality, even though you are acclimated to the shadow life that's been assigned to you. So if you've got a roof over your head, you can provide food for yourself, and maybe you're even in a relationship. That relationship is not fulfilling to you. The money you make is never enough. Having those things that you need baseline is used as a motivation and a fear mechanism because you can recall growing up without that. And your entire existence becomes this muted thing of consumption that isn't leading to anywhere. And it's oftentimes co-signed on because everybody's comparison is some state of absolute desolation. But what they're not talking about, again, is those higher order things that's required to help you cope, which is giving you purpose, failing to acknowledge the fact that the grandparents of those people that sent them off into these greener pastures, they had the advantage of having family, of having purpose. Even if their work did distract them, they did have those baseline coping mechanisms. And the idea of trying to provide an environment for them to have a better life, things seemed to go better before this industrial revolution. And when it all became about trying to get this 9 to 5 job, being in these crowded areas and environments, people never stopped to take the time to realize they're also still human. You don't need to fully sanitize everything there. Some of that bacteria there is of service to you for your immune system to get stronger. It's not to say that you should go down a path of gross neglect. It's that living in a fully sterile environment is as bad as being in one that's completely unsanitary.
I totally agree with you. And it's making me think when you were talking about grandparents and sending people off to do better, it's because we are in this really skewed view of what a better life looks like, right? When
Mm,
people talk about, I want better for my kids, I want better for myself. A lot of what you look at is, I want to be making $10,000 a month or $50,000 a month. I want this house and I want this car and I want this disposable income and the thing that's left out of that is struggle, like you were talking about. And so
mm,
there's no gratitude at that point for what you have because it's all consumption. When say our great grandparents or great great grandparents wanted a better life, they talked about things like a plot of land,
mm,
and that was a better life where you can the work of your hands on your land. How appreciative are you of a carrot that you grab at the store on the way home versus a seed that you planted and nurtured and then there's a carrot? And the
mm,
struggle creates the gratitude and the feelings of efficacy and being of worthwhile. I can feed myself. I can do for myself. I can stand and look at the sunset off of my porch because I have this plot of land and the earth and I are co-creating this life together. So
mm.
that very skewed view of what success is and what to value totally demeans. It takes away the meaning and purpose of living because we now view mediocrity as a curse word. Nobody wants to just be a regular Joe because we have to be successful and we have to overcome and we have to be the best and we got to be the best looking and nobody just wants to be a human being.
It's interesting because the common rebuttal to that is almost baked into the civilizational perspective of what it means to be a human. The idea is that society was supposed to have this ever moving forward concept of progression and that every generation was supposed to be greater than the previous one. And we're seeing that in a general sense, there's deep regression that's been happening. And it's kind of amusing because when you do the particle wave analysis of that particular narrative throughout history, every single generation is complaining about the one previous to it. But
Hmm.
I think that what people aren't necessarily considering is that was in the space where, socially speaking, people were far more distant to one another. So 100 years ago, you may not have in your entire life met more than 500 people.
Right.
And intellectually, I think there's like a limit, neurologically speaking, to, how many personal relationships any one person can have with other human beings. Like there's a cap to that. Like realistically, back then, there's no way you're reaching that. The average person coming across social media now is exceeding that by orders of magnitude. And so the way our brains are wired to just take in information now, it's not like new methodology is being, not methodology, new hardware is not being created. The existing hardware is just being hyper adapted and terraformed to fit it. So what's happening is there's a much wider range of access to information and people, but the actual depth of these things is taking a hit as a consequence of that. So this has been a ongoing thing as technology gets more sophisticated and communication gets faster. People are becoming less in depth but more broad, and the natural consequence to that is everybody kind of has a little bit of everything, but there's not a lot of depth to it. And people are finding out the hard way that that depth is something that isn't really optional. It's sort of really required in order to have an orientation to something deeper than that. And what ends up suffering is the total available information and the social environment as a whole, because there's less people that are grounded and rooted in deeper concepts beyond something that's superficial. It used to have a coexistence with the superficial. Now the seasoning is becoming the main dish, so to speak. And it's really beginning to show in hardline measurements of efficacy and satisfaction. So even the very system that's demanding high quality individuals is failing itself by making this the standard. And we're seeing that even though human beings are safer than ever, they've got more access to anything you could ever want. We live like historical royalty on a baseline basis, and yet deaths of despair are going through the roof higher than there are wars related to violence. It is almost a paradox in relation to that.
Right, because I think we thought that the struggle was the hard part, was the thing to get rid of, you know, that the pain is always the thing to get rid of, and that will make you happy. If you have a headache, take a Tylenol. If you're lonely, get online. And it's all these false equivalents, you know. Just us talking right now, you know. When I do my streams, I show myself, I say what my name is, and people found me, you know. So we also live in an age where even though we have access to people online, I can't get a hug from YouTube, and I'm not going to have the deep relationships with people online as I would in person, but I can very much distract myself and escape into social media or any type of screen time, and my brain will respond. If I watch a romantic comedy, let's say, as I'm watching, my brain will give me chemicals that help me to live vicariously through those actors and that story. And so we can
Mm.
become addicted to those things because we can get a little bit of those dopamine hits. We can get a little bit of adrenaline through, certain movies, action movies, and we can get a little bit of that. And it's sort of like it's enough in the moment to get me through the day to wake up again tomorrow. But they're all fake replacements for the real thing.
And it's interesting because, getting into that idea of almost like having a vicarious or parasocial experience with something, two things tend to occur. That's very interesting. Neurologically speaking, there's more of a visceral retention of information when you have a physical book in your hand and you're flipping through the pages, physically going through that versus scrolling through an ebook.
Yep.
It's something many of us intuitively feel, but neurologically speaking, there are more pathways that allow for you to learn that are engaging when you physically hold that book. And you probably experienced this going through, your education, and just in a general sense, even those of you that do this passively. When you've experienced or read through a book often enough, whether it be for research purposes or, something that is of interest to you, there are ways where you can just feel where the information is in that book. And within 3 or 4 flips of your finger without looking at the table of contents, you're right there on the page you need to be. That's too consistent for it to be a coincidence, in my subjective opinion. Like, there's more neurologically going on. There's more potential pathways that are being conditioned for you to retain that information when you have a physical book in your hand. And I think that there's so much more that's a parallel to that is being given up in lieu of being able to more vicariously experience reality through a mirror.
Well, think about how I just said, emotions are information that we get from our environment. If we're using this false way of, information being fire hosed into our eyeballs from a screen, then it's just like any other sensory organ that it starts to go away. If you were to, plug your nose for a few months, it would be difficult to smell because those neurons are like, oh, we're not needed anymore. We'll die
It'll
off.
redirect. Yep.
Right. We'll go somewhere else. It's sort of like when babies are born with all the neural pathways, not all the neurons, but all the pathways set to learn every single language on Earth. Every baby that's born can learn every language. This is also why if you want to teach a child another language,
do it before a certain way. Yeah,
do it before age 12 because they won't have an accent because those neural pathways are there. But they start dying off pretty quickly so that by age 12, the language or languages that you speak are pretty set, and learning another language becomes very difficult because you have to create those neural pathways. It's also the same as you guys remember those Febreze commercials where it was like you've gone nose blind
because it smells so bad. It's true.
Yeah, because
It's true.
Another thing is you don't see your own nose. When you're just looking around, you don't see your nose. But actually, if you close one eye and the other, you see your nose. So that means your nose is in your field of vision. It just is always there. So your brain quits attending to it and it makes it disappear. And so if we are fire hosed with information and we're told this is how we live, is vicariously through other people, through movies and media and screens and social media and those kind of things, and our sensory organ of being able to emotionally and vibratorily feel another person and just interact with them. And really, if you've ever been really close to somebody and they walk in a room and something's up, you just feel it, something's off. That is not woo-woo stuff. Our brains are set up to do that. That's a survival mechanism, is to kind of get the vibe off of people, but we lose it. It just sort of starts shriveling up and going away because we don't have the physical thing in front of us.
And I think that that's downplayed a little bit too much, where consider then the difference in generation, where you've got human beings that are learning how to interface through technology to get access to the world before they can even speak or even before they can walk.
Mm-hmm.
What that implies for the neurological mapping that's taking place. And the idea is that it's all additive. But if you've reduced the depth of your human experience to just interfacing with these mirrors, then yeah, you've got a broad band of access, but your capacity of depth is what's suffering as a result of that. That's the atrophy. That's the use or lose that occurs as a result of that. And unless you aggressively engage the technology ritualistically, because I think there's a way to do it. If you do it ritualistically, with intention, and in conjunction with community and family, specifically family, you can find a way to have it serve in the place that it should, which is as a tool.
Right.
And it can be used to enhance what's already there rather than replace it, which is what's taking place, whether that be intentional or unintentional. Because the reality is the child is going to be blamed for not having the social skills to interact and sense that psychosomatic component of communication with other people, which may or may not result in empathy which I think is a large reason, and this is me digressing slightly to it all and speculative, so this is my subjective opinion, creating a favorable environment for autistic styles of engagement that are hyper focused on one-dimensional access of right brain, how do I want to say this, right brain dominated orienting of other people, which is done in lieu of or in absence of left brain orientation, where the emotion is seen as something that can be sacrificed for the sake of having a more prefrontal cortex style, logical, analytical, does this make sense, period. And if the answer is no, and if your measurement, if your metric, your manifest of checklist that says this is good, bad, this is what gives meaning, this is what it means to be human, if it's oriented towards the shadow of the mean, which is your typical factory worker consumer, for lack of a better concept or term, this commoditized unit of human capital, then you're by de facto asking for a more shallow society, which the question then begs, who benefits from this kind of thing? And it's not that people who are like this need to be demonized. The issue is human beings are meant to be diverse and occupy the full spectrum of expression. And if you limit it to a single path of that bandwidth, you're leaving the society weak to other modalities or societies that are far more broad, that can accommodate a wider range of socio-cultural expression. And that's the fundamental problem of shrinking the social environment and removing the depth.
Yeah, I have this view of autism it's a little different than I think. Well, we're in this day and age where everybody feels like they have a touch of the tism, and this is it's something that runs through my family. But I think there's a thought about people who are autistic that maybe they lack emotionality, or that everything is logic, or these kind of things. But what I have seen in autistic people that I've worked with, and having autistic sons, is that autism sort of takes away your bullshit, excuse my language, your BS filter, meaning that we're either going to have a deep conversation, or I'm just really not all that interested in talking with you. Social niceties and small talk and those kind of things that really don't seem to serve a purpose or go towards a greater meeting just are seen as very
waste of time-ish or non-genuine.
Right. It's a waste. And so I have said that I think that in some ways, the rise of autism can be seen as a response to becoming such a shallow, ego-driven, masking society, when it is then infused with people who are like, nah, that's BS and a waste of time. But, or greeting other people with, hey, what's your special interest? I really like this or that, for me, I really like archaic religion. That's a special interest of mine. Do you want to talk about that? That I think it's super cool.
And you can hyper focus on that, almost like a superpower.
Oh yeah. And then you become kind of an expert in that. And so I think, there's all sorts of theories that, there's not more autistic people. It's just recognized now. Yeah, I think there's some of that. Yeah. There's about vaccinations, and
I didn't want to go there. I wanted to be clear that when I mentioned autistic undertones, I was specifically talking about kind of like a shadow emulation of it, not the actual diagnosis of it.
Like a Vulcan.
Yeah, just so we're clear. Right. So the idea with the autism is obviously it's on a spectrum. And I suppose what I'm saying is it's the shadow projected by the autism that society is starting to mirror, where it's not that they don't want to have the small talk. It's just that there's no depth. So
Right.
there's no ability to engage with that. So it's passed off as if it's small talk when it's
Yeah.
not. And I think there's a distinct and succinct difference there where that shadow, because I don't think there's too many terms in English that would even begin to encapsulate the shallowing of human consciousness. That's probably going to deserve a separate video.
Yeah.
But I think this is a byproduct. And so it's not that it's actually autism or even emulating it. It's just presenting this shallow sense of not being able to go in depth or unwilling to, but
Mm.
under the guise of shutting anything else down that goes against a self-directed or selfish predetermined direction, trajectory, or even a model that they've been conditioned for. You know what I'm saying?
Right. Right. And I think, kind of speaking about the shallow state that we're in, and you kind of bring it, I'm all the way back to meaning and purpose.
Right.
I I was diverging way off of that, but I think a lot of times people need they need help with finding a meaning and purpose because that wasn't it wasn't fostered in us as children. We
Mm.
were taken, out of our parents' home at, 4 or 5 years old, nowadays 3 years old, and put in a classroom and told to sit on a very uncomfortable chair and sit still while information about who we are and what we think is fire hosed into us. And it's repeated and repeated and repeated and repeated. We are never, children all the way through public school are never taught critical thinking. They're never taught self awareness. They're never taught about instincts or insight or self resilience, self knowledge. They're just taught who they are and what they think enough to be able to regurgitate it on a test. And so by the time you get out of school, you graduate and you have this piece of paper and you're like, "Hey, I'm really good at school." And so you're like, "Well, let me go to more school." And then you get very specialized fire hosing at the bigger school that's more expensive. And then you can do the thing. I always say it's monkey push the button. You're taught how to push the button at school, and you get rewarded for how well you push the button they tell you to push. And people will come out of college, out of university with master's degrees and PhDs and all kinds of things and still don't know how to think. They just know how to school really well.
I call it, in martial arts and Budo in general, this term is understood as failure to understand the meaning behind the movement. So
Yeah.
what they do is they copy the instructor and they can emulate the movements, but they don't have the context behind them truly. So in government agencies, oftentimes this is referred to as teaching the test, not the subject. And so people can
Hmm.
have a clear understanding of how to do the job, but fail the test to place. And it's completely counterintuitive. But when you start getting into real parts of the government that actually have to get things done, everything you listed is part of their indoctrination program. Everything.
Yeah.
Not the monkey push the button or what Gen Z likes to call put the fries in the bag. I think that's hilarious. Uh, put your fries in the bag. But the idea of teaching critical thinking, and it's a large process of undoing your childhood, essentially. Like, it's as if they correct the problems they knew your upbringing and education gave you and then
Mhm.
replace it with this ideal template that fits organizational need. I see that consistently with organizations that have to get things done. I
Well,
won't name any three-letter acronyms, but I think you see where I'm
yeah,
going.
I will say this. The very first U.S. Department of Education president, a Rothschild,
Oh, snap.
1908. I think,
I
said,
think it was 1907. They kicked off the
was
public
it?
education here. Yep.
Okay. But he said, I don't want a nation full of thinkers. I want a nation full of workers. And that's all public school has ever been, is creating a nation of workers. And even when you go to university, it's so that you can work still a specialized job and shoot those resources uphill. Now, I'm not a proponent of throwing the baby out with the bathwater and just getting rid of the entire US Department of Education, but I think we have to realize that thinking was never the point. Obeying was the point of education. And so how do you, as a child, we ask children all the time, what do you want to be when you grow up? And you know, I'll just speak for my kids, become teenagers and say, I don't want to grow up. It looks scary out there. I don't want to adult. I don't want to do that. That looks miserable. Um, so, we don't teach kids to even tap into their innate passions. We just take advantage of their innate talent. And it's unfortunate because then as an adult you have to reparent yourself if you want to go back and find your purpose and meaning.
It's hilarious. It's like I said, these agencies, the very first thing they do is through trauma and shocking you to force that neuroelasticity again. Shout out to Project Monarch and all of that.
Whew.
They've learned that, yeah. Shout out to them, man. Shout out to Canada. They I
Shout
ain't gonna
out to
say anything
Stranger
else because I right. Yeah, I like my channel. So
Things.
but they've discovered that through forcing trauma, they can reintroduce elasticity in the brain, and then you're right for reconditioning. And in that
Yep.
reconditioning process, they build you right back up again. They give you those critical skills that you need, and you all of a sudden get to be a semi-complete human being with nice, convenient triggers in place. But the thing is, what happens to human beings when you put that type of conditioning from the onset that's intentional, and you start to get exactly what the purpose of rites of passages do? You
Oh,
get
yeah.
the exact purpose behind giving people astrological orientations and anticipating their strengths and weaknesses and providing them vocations from the onset that suit their nature, and being
Mm.
observant of those children and watching what they naturally digress to, and then structuring their education based off of that. Like this is how human beings got ahead historically. And then
Oh,
all of a sudden, we run into the shadow of the mean. It's this industrialization. And even as you put, you get a bunch of people who are programmed to follow instructions out of context with no meaning outside of here are these trinkets that represent you did good. And
yep.
as long as you get that you did good, you did great. And what happens when everybody has access to the seashells now? They start to lose their meaning. I mean, you would go out into the water, free dive, get them on your own volition. It was a lot of work. It was risky. You may not come back. And every time you came back, maybe you had 3 or 4 of those shells, but it was the work it took for you to do that. It's nothing to do with being on the upper echelons of some hierarchy. But you as a human being found value in going out there and having the tactile experience of doing something that appears mundane, but are more satisfied with that than somebody that's making a large amount of money, but doesn't even know why they exist. You know what I'm saying? And I'm not trying to make an argument against money in and of itself. What I'm saying is that there is a deeper humanistic inertia that's missing because too many people reach the top and have all of these things taken care of, and it is measurable, where people who are in abjectly worse conditions are far more fulfilled, animated with gratitude, and happier than
Hmm.
people who essentially have everything. It's
Hmm.
absolutely incredible.
Yeah, because money is supposed to be a tool,
Yep.
not an outward sign of how your deity, however you say, however you view that, whether it's God or your boss, or the billionaires or elites or whoever you worship, it becomes this outward sign of the blessings bestowed upon you. I always say about church, one of my I have a lot of issues with organized religion, but I won't go into that. We're talking, well, I mean, we could. It's talking about meaning, but one of my biggest things is you will have a person who is up there telling you all about the terribleness of you and all these sinful behaviors, while pastor's married to his third wife and she's got a 3-carat diamond ring and he drives away in his brand new Beamer, and you go back to work, and it just all seems so backwards.
Yeah, it's again, we're back to that concept of cultural inertia. And
Yeah.
it's why I've been really considering my stance on culture. I'm starting to think that the problem isn't necessarily culture, but it's civilization.
Yeah.
And it's people who are being animated by civilizational orientations that they don't fit at all. And in the United States, there is no civilization here. Everything's been imported, from the language to what we are calling culture. These are more like cultural adaptations to the environment or coping mechanisms to the environment, because this particular portion of the hemisphere was not designed to support civilization as much as it was to support business, which is an extension of a civilization. And that's the difference between a place like here or places on the continent, or the indigenous people who were here before colonization took place, or even places all throughout Asia, India, China, even Thailand, parts of the original Caucasus Mountain inhabitants. You know what I'm saying? Like, these were civilizations that people gave up to participate in this idea of a culture that orients itself around Western principles. And here it starts with race, which again, you give up all of these things to gain access to that, which it's like this poor simulacrum of civilization and culture. And so what becomes the currency of exchange? It isn't trust, it's the money and the collateral. So this transition of human relationship gets approximated by material acquisition of things that are supposed to represent a unit of trust/currency.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where that dehumanization comes from. It's as if we're here trying to live at your job. That's the equivalency of all of that. And while you can, the things you're giving up to make that happen.
Right. Are you living to work or working to live?
I think for some people it's both. And it's not so much about your relationships with other people, which again seems to really be the missing ingredient as it relates to purpose and meaning. I'm still reminded of that key Swahili phrase, Mimi ni mtu kwa sababu kuna watu. I'm a person because there are people. And I don't know if you can get there truly without finding some way to establish a meaning and value in relation to other people who remotely give a damn about you, starting with you giving a damn about you inherently because you're human. And
Right.
that concept I'll say this last part, this concept is so alien that it's been rife with anagrams to weakness and worthlessness, which is mind-boggling when you take that step back and look at the bigger picture that's arisen as a result of that.
Yeah. Well, what I was going to say was, because the only thing that has value are the things that can be commodified. So, then a person doesn't have value if their outputs cannot be commodified. And then
Mm.
we internalize that. So,
Mm.
there was that phrase, love yourself. You have to love yourself, do the work to love yourself. People say, I'm going to stay single and learn how to love myself and how to be single. And it's interesting that we live in this time where people feel like they have to be hermits to learn how to love themselves, because you do need the mirror of other people to get to know yourself, because who I am in isolation is not who I am.
Yeah, there's many different masks that not let me not say that. It isn't so much that it's a mask, and this is, I guess, me speaking from my subjective opinion. I think that oftentimes we see ourselves in other people, and that information is mutually valuable.
Well, I mean, like, if I sit at my house and even even if I'm not watching screens all the time, if I'm just in my house by myself, asking myself, self, who are you? I can have lots of great discussions. I can, reprocess memories that I have. I can discover things about myself. But do you know what I will never figure out sitting in my house by myself? I won't ever figure out, where's my line for losing my temper? How do I love other people? What do I
Hmm.
need? What do I need to feel fulfilled? Um, how would I respond if I see injustices? There's so many things about who I am that and who we are as human beings, because we are intended and meant to be collective people and social people and connected people, that if I sit by myself as a hermit, I can only go so far in learning who I am. And then I will move into feeling agoraphobic. I know a lot of people who start on this journey of, I need to get to know myself. And so they isolate and they end up never wanting to be around other people and actually starting to fear the world, because everything becomes scary at that point.
It can, if, and that's the difference between isolation and solitude.
Yeah.
So in our training, we get this idea of, because this was a very long standing argument against the various seinen of, well, I'll go ahead. I'll just go there. No point in even alluding to it. So in ninjutsu, this idea, the concept of it, is nothing more in general than a skill set that can be acquired and expressed through various other means. So there was this tendency of living in these remote regions that were pretty isolated.
Hmm.
And sometimes they were individuals that existed independently in solitude. And oftentimes they would be known as seinin. I don't necessarily want to get into the Yamabushi. Gyogami's talking about them. Those are the mountain warriors. Many of them were tied to the Sohei tradition, or armed monk traditions, that existed also in very similar regions, especially the Koga and Iga provinces. And their whole thing was they were monks that eventually partially adopted vows and engaged in fornication and military operations, which is an asterisk there. But what you did have were mountain warrior mystics, who were known as Shugendo,
Hmm.
and they had this whole critique on the seinen, or mountain hermits, of what's the point of acquiring enlightenment on your mountain when you have enlightenment within that particular environment, but when you enter into the world, it is all forgotten.
Mm.
What's it for?
This That totally reminds me. I brought up Ram Dass before. If you guys haven't listened to Ram Dass, I recommend it because he's hilarious. But this is a guy back in the 60s, he grew up Jewish, ethnically and religiously, and decided that he wanted transcendence. And
Mm.
so, it being the 60s, the way he decided to get transcendence was with LSD. And so he he and a couple others embarked on this journey of how high can we transcend and can we meet God? And so in this journey of what all drugs do we need to mix together? How much LSD can we do? And this went on for years on trying to reach this transcendence until he realized that the leaving of God was more painful now that he had transcended to that space of bliss and ascension, that
Hmm.
he had to find a way to maintain it. And so then he embarked on, his name is not Ram Dass, his name was changed. His name was Albert. But he then started going around and getting a guru and talking to Zen monks and traveling to different places and foregoing a lot of physical
Comforts and conveniences.
physical conveniences to try to find a way to stay transcended. And one of the things he talks about is he would go and he would be so enlightened, and he would be, deep in the jungle with his guru, and he would just be so high, just so higher than everybody else, and so transcended. And then he would come back and see his dad, and his dad would say to him, "When are you going to get a job?" And immediately he's back and he's arguing with his father, and he totally lost all of his enlightenment and all of his, "Oh my gosh, aren't I such an ascended being?" He totally lost it when faced with adversity.
But that's just it. That's what I was leading to, this idea of the need to acquire those states. And once you've acquired it, go out into the world in pilgrimage. The concept is known as Musha Shugyo. And for many individuals practicing Nimpo in this era, and even many samurai did the same thing when later on in the Edo period, Zen was really introduced to the culture. The idea was, all right, within your controlled environment, you've amassed a particular set of skills and ability and efficacy. Now you have to go out and test it in the world. And then once you've done so, do so with an open mind, experience the extremes. And once you've done that, record what you've learned and then test that too. Synthesize that. Go out into nature once more on this mountain, re-attain your understanding, and you will learn that transcendence occurs in degrees and patterns. It isn't that you grab something and hold on to it forever. There are ways that through the mundane, you can acquire the extraordinary. A word for that is satori. It stands for sudden enlightenment. I think that this whole concept, once you've let go of the idea of trying to acquire or take it or transcend forcibly, and you just let it happen through mundane action and positive intention over time, it naturally expresses itself. And to use a contemporary example that I find hilarious, it and it reminds me of Dragon Ball and watching Vegeta go Super Saiyan in comparison to Goku. I think some folks in the chat will understand what I'm saying, where the lesson in it was Vegeta always chasing after Goku, trying to be like him, instead of really taking to his own nature as the last remaining royalty of the Saiyan race, essentially. He let his position and his status get in the way of being in alignment with his nature. And so as a result, when Goku ascended to becoming a Super Saiyan, which was this big myth in their culture, he felt deficient. He felt less than. He continually compared himself to Goku. And it wasn't until even after he went through all of this work, he went out into space, brought himself into isolation, and was on a planet stranded. And now the moon that he was on is being attacked by these meteors that are crashing because a meteor storm is happening, and his ship is about to get destroyed. And if it is, then he's stranded on this planet or this moon for the rest of his life. And so after a particularly long training session, this meteor shower hits, his ship is about to get destroyed, and he's just thinking about the ridiculousness of it all. He'd been training for years. He's the prince of all of his race, and some random person that was sent to a backwater place called Earth reached the height of pinnacle of power before he did. And he's ready to just give up. He's like, it's ridiculous. Why am I worried about this? This is absolutely goofy. I quit. If this is how it is what it is. And he just let go. And as he's letting go and stop caring about it so much, he suddenly turns Super Saiyan. And he now has the power to completely evaporate the meteors that are falling. And it was all he had to do, was stop focusing so hard on trying to acquire it, that he just allowed the process to happen on its own. And it reminds me of this concept of Wu Wei, of effortless action, that's talked a lot about in Taoism. And through letting his ego go, his hands were free to acquire new power and new understandings of things that were already there. Yeah, go ahead.
I was actually going to bring up the Wu Wei. So you totally went there. But I think the part of the Wu Wei that I like is not just the giving in to the flow. It's realizing that the point is the journey. It's not the acquisition. And so when you relax and you flow, it's easier to get to a different point if you go with the river than if you walk upstream. And so if you relax, you will get to a different point, and you have to release control of where you end up. And so, the point, is the meaning of each person's existence it's an individual thing of their journey, and everybody's journey is going to look different. We all have similarities, we all have different things that we've gone through, but you are the main character, and going in the flow doesn't mean that you just, hey, what life happens to me now and I have no control over it. It's seeing each thing as a new thing, not this is something to get over. This is something to suffer through. This is, when they talk in Wu Wei, I was listening to one person who was talking about how simple things such as washing the dishes can be a moment of bliss.
Yep.
Because you think about the softness of the bubbles and how they catch the light, and you're taking something that was unclean and you're making it clean, and that bodes of a future of having a meal, maybe with someone else. And it can be just such a moment of beauty. But if we don't take each moment and each thing as its own thing, then we're just suffering life, and we're not going with the flow.
And I think that this ties into this concept of absolute acceptance, zettai-juyo, of accepting things for what they are. And I think that English struggles in presenting this concept because it's too much in alignment with apathy. That's the word I was looking for.
Yeah.
This passive, as you said, the world now happens to me. It's whatever happens, I'm able to respond in accordance with my nature without regret. And there's a level of freedom that comes with that. But you can't be animated by fear once that occurs. You have to have the strength of mind, body, and spirit, and the belief that everything is as it is, so that the requisite for courage can be presented there, so that you can live life with a measure of radical self-acceptance, which transmutes eventually to universal acceptance. And so there's a deeper measure of power you gain access to that you have had from the very beginning. It's almost a self-permission sort of deal. And when you begin to understand things from that angle, once you start interfacing with other intentions in the world, you begin to realize that they are propositions that are presented to you. They challenge your mind, body, and or spirit, and they ask, are you strong enough to maintain this pattern? Yes or no? And oftentimes we find ourselves in situations more so where it isn't that we lack the strength, we lack the belief. And it's because we've placed these conditions, these if-then statements on access to things that are inherently ours by right, by divine right of way. These are things you have access to. But we place these self-limitations that, again, are born from fear and conditioning that divorce us from that power. And it's not until oftentimes we get confronted with profound difficulty, or we're presented with this interesting tendency of human consciousness, or entities with consciousness in general, to creatively overcome insurmountable odds through limitation. So there's this paradox of the expression of genius through limitation, where a lot of art forms are realized by placing artificial limitations, and it's through those limitations that we tap into something greater than we realize, and we're able to accomplish miraculous things. It can be expressed through art. We've seen it happen under extraordinary circumstances where people you may care about are in danger, or acts of ingenuity where people are put under these incredible pressures and these ridiculous restraints, and then new ways of doing things are made realized. Like this is a I think it was just so common historically that adopting this cookie cutter way of living, this cookie cutter template, it prevents you from being able to access those mundane moments of potentially profound insight and not so much ascendance, but socio-intellectual progression on a completely different track that allows you to experience that mundane reality at a deeper degree of appreciation and gratitude.
Yeah, because you've always been told you're limited. If you didn't know you were limited, then you could reach those much easier. If you didn't know that you couldn't lift a car, then you wouldn't be concerned that you couldn't lift a car.
It's that if then. So it's the belief portion that we're describing there. And, it's not to say that, how do I want to word this carefully? There are some people who would encourage the complete opposite of that, where you can do anything, and it runs a risk of getting into that toxic positivity we were talking about.
Right.
Where, people just blindly hard select yes and just keep going, where, 99% and 1% looks like 50-50. That's just no. But it's recognizing that genius can be born from those limitations. And I describe this as a warrior archetype oftentimes, and it gets expressed with, actually, I talked about this in the last precept I covered in the Dokudo about Mimoto Musashi confronting his most difficult situation, his most difficult challenging his most difficult one-on-one, because he's done some ridiculous stuff. But he was about to face Sasaki Kojiro, and this dude, he was a final boss. I don't know any other way of articulating that. And for this duel, it had been hyped up for months. There was a problem with the previous school that he'd gone to. It was a bunch of ego involved. It was basically the fight, the duel of that era. And he shows up and doesn't even have a sword. And the local daimyo's there. The equivalent of the press is there. People are there to record it. This is official. Whatever happens in this duel, that's it. And he shows up and he don't even have a sword. He just takes a knife, cuts a boat oar, and uses the boat oar to completely one-shot this dude. And it's it's through those limitations, having a fundamental understanding of everything he's involved with. There was no thoughts of, I can't do this, I need this, or I need that.
There was no
He
fear.
he looked at the situation. He just responded accordingly with principle that was born from, at that point in time, over 20 years of training. And he just let it express itself in general, naturally, with no conscious thought involved. This idea of mushin, or the void as expressed in the mind, which is oftentimes referred to as a body of water that's still. And when it's still, it can reflect the image of the moon. That concept is called suigetsu, or the water moon. That when you engage in these kind of activities, when you engage in everyday life like this, having this suigetsu or mushin, this thoughtless flow, which is hinting at the whole concept of wu wei, you're out of your own way enough to allow for these things to happen spontaneously. And it's a way you can engage and experience the now that can even work in positions of stress that I don't see equivalents to this historically, but I hear them talking about it now of concepts like flow state, et cetera, et cetera.
Mhm. I'm do you mind if I answer Hurricane Greg real quick
Oh
from his
yeah, go ahead.
comment? He
Yeah, I'll
said,
go
"Can
highlight that.
oneself transcend one's ego?" Um, Anytime you've ever stubbed your toe, you've transcended your ego. Every time you've ever been punched in the gut or hit in your genitalia, you transcend your ego. We can all transcend our ego by simply removing that mask or forgetting who you are. So you can do it in moments of pain like that, where you forget who you are. You know, we all look silly when we stub our toes really bad, right? Like we make all kind of noise and fall all over the floor and, do all kinds of things. And we totally forget who we are, how we're trying to present, or those kind of things. But I think the start, always the start of trying to transcend your ego or even to find meaning and purpose, is to not try to transcend your ego, because it sounds like you're trying to leave your ego behind, but to realize that your ego is your bodyguard. Your ego was your first bodyguard, and your ego will be your last bodyguard. Our ego is where all of our coping and calming mechanisms come from, and our ego is the holder of all of our trauma. And so, do you really want to rise above your ego or leave it behind? Or do you want to incorporate it so that you can ascend, so that your ego is the holder of all your trauma and all your coping mechanisms, and your ability to calm yourself in states of high stress and pain? You really want to get rid of it, or do you want to incorporate it? I'm much more about balance and balancing the shadow and the ego, um, because it is one mechanism. The shadow and the ego is one mechanism. It's like a teeter-totter. It's a balancing network. If you see someone with a gigantic ego to the point where they don't even know themselves, you can trust and believe that they have a very large compensatory shadow. And so the way to get to ascension is to incorporate all of those things into one cohesive whole, rather than an individualized state or knowledge of self. That's my
Yeah.
answer to that question.
Yeah, and I think that that's really the goal of initiation at its core. It's so that you can confront that ego through placing yourself in positions of adversity. And that's where you learn who you actually are. And the goal is not that there's this greater than, lesser than thing. It's about learning to truly come to a measure of acceptance of it. Because when you're stripped away of everything and you have nothing left, oftentimes that core that's left behind, that ugly core that isn't attractive, that's all this negativity, is what will save your behind and get you through everything at the end.
Absolutely.
So giving it those, it's kind of like, I keep thinking it because anime does such a good job at expressing some of those shadow archetypes. I'm reminded of the Naruto series and how the Jinchuriki work, those sealed beasts. Look at it like this. I think Bleach did a good job with this as well. When your needs aren't being met, and this was the whole point of the third verbal martial art form, verbal sword form I had expressed when I talked about the demon gate and why I got into concepts like the collective unconscious and archetypes, and how the pattern that you get your needs met or deny them from others is really that ego expressing itself through the shadow of getting it done. Because if you don't do it consciously, your ego will take over and make sure it gets done. And the way it'll do that, oftentimes there's different kinds of, for lack of a better term, monsters or negative spirited entity expressions that will make that happen. You know, that's how oftentimes it gets expressed artistically. But the key to it is to not demonize it as much as recognize that it's acting in your benefit in truth. And when you can come to terms with that, understand that it's following your lead. It's acting in accordance to what you're doing. And when you can integrate that acceptance into your everyday life, when you see this training, and that's the key, to not compare what your ego is to others, but to compare yourself to maybe you of previous days. That's your war. That's your conflict. And if you animate it with trust, then it becomes a required step for self-development and a critical step in solving problems. If you don't trust it, it becomes a surefire ticket to destroying yourself and potentially other people.
Well, I think that kind of speaks to what looks like that's maybe an Ankh is the name of this person, talking about spiral dynamics and integral theory. Just the lens that you are viewing things through will change how your ego operates. You know, if you are in that egocentric stage where ego and self is the most important thing, then your ego will act accordingly. And so will your shadow. Because if you're egocentric and you think you're the most important thing, and then you're faced with somebody who doesn't think you're the most important thing, they're totally going against your framework. And so then your thoughts behave accordingly. Then your shadow says they hate you and they want bad things for you. You know? And so
textbook conflict, start the boss music, start the battle thing.
Right. And so, you know, it has to do with, you know, the state that you're in, you know, the state of your consciousness and the lens by which you look at the world. And so the more frameworks, the more meta frameworks that you can incorporate into how you see the world, the more self-knowledge that you'll have. You'll go from being two-dimensional to multi-dimensional in your consciousness states.
Yeah, and what it provides for you is just more metaphysical footing for you to cope with those points of resistances. So it's at that stage you start learning, okay, is this an adversary or is it an enemy? And these are very different things, but they appear the same if you're looking at it through a low resolution framework of, they said, no, that's it, we're fighting now. It's, oh, they're afraid of something, I see. Then there's an opportunity here. And when you can learn to trust yourself to recognize that, okay, this challenge isn't occurring because of a belief that I'm inherently lesser than. This challenge is occurring because there's a fundamental misalignment with what's taking place here. And from there, you can then respond appropriately rather than react to the emotional response that occurs and then a feeling. And it's that agency that comes with being able to recognize this process and intercept it earlier and earlier that leads to a positive integration of your ego through through coming to terms with it. Because, and this is me speaking with an asterisk. I'll lean in on the astrology piece. I got Scorpio in 5 different places. So
Oh,
our
geez.
whole I've got it in 5 places, and all the places that I look like a Star Wars villain when you look at my chart. And the whole thing is ego death. That's all it's about. It's completely nuclear destruction of ego over and over again. I often say that my perspective is born from a mountain of corpses that consist of my older selves. And it's the only reason why I have the perspective I do, because I've gone through that so much. But the key is there's a rejuvenative piece that is inherent to it that's permitted me to continue after being reduced to such low states. So there's this bounce back, this elasticity. And it's, for some people, that's traumatizing to the point where it would destroy them. But then
Yeah.
there's others that it can be a form of self-evident, okay, I survived that, so I definitely can survive this. And these are 2 completely different positions of orientation. And I don't know if everybody comes with this software downloaded, if you can even download it. But that's part of that post-traumatic growth point that I was describing earlier before, versus the ego being protected so that it doesn't get completely shattered, because not everybody can piece it back together again. But what I will say is, related to that wu wei is the wabi sabi, which I think is just as valid. And the idea of wabi sabi is to take what's broken, put it back together again, and in piecing it back together again, it in and of itself becomes an artistic expression that expresses a kind of beauty that wasn't even possible prior to that. So if you've seen like those bowls that are broken,
Oh, yeah.
and they'll piece them together with gold, and like it makes this pattern that looks absolutely incredible. That's a artistic expression of wabi sabi. I think that gets into this understanding of the kind of things that can be created through resilience, radical self-acceptance, and the willingness to face adversity and grow as a result of that, especially when you don't compare yourself to others for the sake of acquiring a greater than, lesser than value assessment.
Do you think, since we're 2 hours in, or maybe, you can ask your subs, do you think that it would be beneficial for us to kind of hone in on radical self-acceptance as a starting point for finding purpose, meaning, empathy, all the things that you talk about?
Maybe we can, because I think that it would be worth presenting a dichotomy to blind grinding, which has its place,
Mhm.
versus intentional acceptance of fault with the intention of cultivating strength in mind, body, and spirit so that you can have the belief and courage to move forward. I think they look so similar that it's easy to skip steps and downplay that process, because I think more people find themselves there from a position of fresh trauma, and it's rarely expressed of people deliberately getting to that point.
Yeah. In dialectical behavioral therapy, one of the biggest tenets that we talk about is radical acceptance. And that's both internal and external. Um, and it feels like in this day and age that we really lack radical acceptance, both internally and externally, to go with the flow, to be in the way, not in the way of something, but to be in the way. um, you have to have radical acceptance. And that's part of, this journey of transcendence as well. And I don't know if that would be something you'd want to talk about in the future.
I think that's actually a great direction for our next discussion. Um, let's hone in on that, because these things are they exist in a kind of superposition in relation to each other. So previous concepts we've brought up will reappear as we use that as a general framework to move forward, because I don't think it's very easy finding these kinds of conversations outside of a commercial context where it's like, well,
Yeah.
how can you make your corporate employees even better slaves? Like I mislike that. And a lot of these concepts are from these sort of seminar-esque, you know, positive psychology oriented, that's really about blinding people with light rather than illuminating a darkness, if that makes sense.
Right. Yeah, no, I totally agree.
Yeah, I'm down for it. I don't think people would have a problem with that, because it's a natural progression to move forward with it, because yeah, I don't see too many people highlighting this point, and I think it'll be a useful tool to help people gain a greater degree of efficacy of the measure of self-acceptance that they've acquired, especially given the general kinds of topics that happen in the space, because ultimately it leads to giving you the software to accept accountability for not only yourself, but to not blame yourself for things you have no control over, which is what I think this leads to. It's learning to properly let go of things you can't change without losing the courage to address the things that you can. And then over time, having a measure of discernment to know the difference between the two. I think
It
that's
helps
the
you
key.
to let go of judgment and comparison.
I say the only person to compare yourself to is the you of yesterday. The only thing you can control is the degree of self-centeredness that you want to have towards something. And it's not that that's evil, but it's something only you can decide, because only you have that perspective. And the key is not demonizing that, but recognizing that there are things that are completely outside of your control, but that doesn't mean you're helpless. And
Right.
there are ways to tangibly improve your scenario. And you just start by one little bit at a time, and you can and will get there, or at least get somewhere. Because you've got these 3 different dimensions, mind, body, and spirit, and they all work together with one another to acquire that.
Absolutely. They are not independent of one another, and I think they've been separated so much
Yep.
in this quote modern time.
Yep.
That's part of that regressive. We're actually regressing.
Yeah, in a way where, unironically, older ancestors probably had a better grip on this than we do today. And it's not even by a little bit, it's by a very long shot. It's getting pretty bad.
Totally agree.
But that's the good news. There is definitely something to do about that. So let's hard lock that in. Radical self-acceptance. And we'll rock with that as the theme. And as we move forward, we'll continue to work with some of these terms. And with some of these concepts, I guess what I'll do is I'll go back and provide a bit of a bibliography on some of these terms, because we talked about Ikigai today. We talked about transpersonal psychology. We talked about transcendence, Satori, Wu Wei, and Wabi Sabi. So I'll keep that in mind and make some notes for that in the future, so that when we revisit some of these terms, because we're entering into a lot of Eastern Taoist and Buddhist concepts, many people, unless they have a distinct and succinct interest in that, probably have no clue what these terms kind of mean or how they relate in the non-commercial sense. And I think that they would lend themselves as excellent tools to contextualize these concepts.
Right. Like you said, the English language kind of fails at certain words. And so we don't have to recreate them. We can just use the words that are already there.
Yep. I like the concept of symbols. Symbols say a lot more than words do, in my opinion.
Oh, I come from a long line of people who use symbology, so I'm with you on that.
That's fair enough. But well, I guess we are at the 2-hour mark. We'll go ahead and take a few views from the audience here. If anybody has any questions, like, do you got room for questions before we throw
Sure.
deuces?
Sure.
Okay, well, we've got a little bit of a window. If you guys have any questions, definitely drop them in the chat. He says, Shita Kitai, folding and hammering oneself in the forge to remove oneself's impurities. Removing oneself's impurities, is that not killing of one's true self? Not necessarily. So the idea is that's an aspect of transformation. And in reality, since you can't occupy two spaces at the same time, you do have to die in relation to the older form to give birth to the new. The key is letting go. And there's a distinct difference with regards to viewing that as a form of non-acceptance. The idea of classifying them as impurities is really more so learning to understand those aspects of you that are you versus those aspects of you that have been implanted by others to presume that they're you, so that you could be of service to them that you don't necessarily consent to. And that's a process. It's just like the forging process of ironing out the impurities in metal before it can be shaped and molded for a specific purpose. It's a form of self-maintenance and growth, and it's part of the refinement process. It's not a matter of killing your true self. It's actually the total opposite, where you're learning to get out of your own way. And there are other ways that people have colorfully articulated that point, but I think that's the key with regards to that particular process you're describing. You're free to comment on that if you want.
Yeah, I don't have anything to add to that. The impurities would be like the indoctrination, the things that mask and cover and change your true self. So if we look at this as sort of like putting yourself through struggles and tests, to prove your mettle through the forge of the fire, then it removes the things that are not your true self. So what comes out on the other side, sans the impurities, is your true self. So it would not be killing the true self.
Yep. Again, getting out of your own way. You'd be surprised at what you were calling you tends to be this patchwork of concepts that were done to accommodate other people. It's interesting. And the irony in all of that is when you finally get done, people tend to like what you've done more than what they freaking presented to you. And if they got out your way in the very beginning, 9 times out of 10, the things that they were trying to impose on you, they would have addressed. And a lot of times these are things that they need to handle themselves and they haven't done. So it's interesting how that pattern recurs so often. Gyogami says the etymology of radical means root. The radical acceptance would require digging deep in what we are. And I think that's what this is about, fundamentally at the core. Not being too afraid to take a look at that. It really surprises me how often I hear people say how uncomfortable they are with their own thoughts by themselves.
Mm-hmm. And they judge themselves. But I think, it kind of, it makes me think about how when men meet each other, what's the first thing you ask the first time you meet a man besides his name?
I don't know. We ask what's good. You know what I'm saying?
Okay, but one of the first questions men usually ask each other is, "What do you do?"
Yeah, it can be. So there's different contexts to that. So part of it is understanding where in the hunting pack can I fit you. So if you have a particular angle of expertise, I now have a region of interest I can apply to you, because maybe we're short on something and you've got this skill set that's awesome. Now our group's better as a result of that. Or, depending on your orientation towards that, it becomes what language are they speaking with regard to their posturing the world, because oftentimes for men, our work tends to have a direct parallel and correlation to our self-identity.
That's what I
So
was going towards.
yeah,
That
yeah,
your value is based on what you do, and it's not even where do you work or what do you do for work, it's what do you do, you know?
yeah.
But that kind of plays into the, even in like advocacy circles and stuff, somebody will point something out and it's like, well, what are you doing? What have you done? It's always about the value is on what
I
you're
think
doing.
I think that is a unintended maybe it was intended, but I see this being a thing more so at the turn of the Industrial Revolution, where that natural tendency to inquire about what you do was to improve the hunting party turned into a how much of a liability are you? And that
Mhm.
comes from that whole fear projection pattern that's really there. And it's largely expressed in men in that particular regard because of the way women have adapted to an expectation of having these things serve as a proxy for the
Yeah.
value of dudes as well. So, this is a psychic feedback loop that really expresses that. Like, I think men and women approach that from different parts of that cycle, but I think it's a corruption of an older, well-intended principle of
I'm
where
sure.
can I fit you in the hunting pack? And then, this tool, this ritual of hailing went from a positive undertone to yet another stressor that is creating dissonance amongst people, which again, we're back to square one again.
Yeah. I mean, women always ask each other, do you have kids? We don't ever
Right.
say, what do you do? We say, do you have kids? Because it's where it's like this is your value in society. So are you participating in society as prescribed? Do you have children? So, you know,
Well, you saw the intellectual social software we talked about before with political Mandalorianism, and
yeah,
that's the appendix two in that whole thing that deals completely with what you just said.
yeah,
And that's the default. And again, the problem ends up being if you introduce all of this technology and you remove people from that, naturally they're going to start developing social autoimmune issues, like corrupting that to your direct value as a human being in
right,
isolation, and not meaning relative to the aggregate of being human. In other words, you have to justify your existence there because there's this undertone of there's scarcity and people have to carry their own weight. And if you're dead weight, here you go with this group selection algorithm.
right.
So, it's these are again all of these symptoms of well-intended concepts that get corrupted into autoimmune disorder, socially speaking, and then it
Yeah.
projects out to the society. And then here we are,
Yeah.
it,
Sort of like, are you paying your debt to society?
right, justify the reason why you're drawing breath. And
Right.
there's a whole line of thinking that's related to that. And, shout out to the Malthusians. They really kick-started that around the same time the first industrial revolution started kicking off. So the two sort of go hand in hand, and it's unfortunate that people reduce themselves to just units of measure. And as we enter into the fourth industrial revolution, that's going to become an even bigger question, because the
Right.
end result of that is now nobody's communicating with people. So you go from not seeing value in the person next to you to not seeing value in yourself. Now what?
Right. Totally agree.
Mm. But yeah, I think we've covered everything folks were asking about. Um, yeah, because we caught some of them as they came in.
Right.
Maggie, it's been a pleasure as usual.
Thank
We
you so
will
much.
well, thank you, and we will absolutely figure in on the next one. Speaking about radical self acceptance, we got one more. Diaspora L. What do you do? Oh, he was talking about the. He
Yeah.
was making a general statement. Right. Yeah. Shout out to that. Yeah. That's pretty much what the social discourse has devolved to. You know, what's your net value of give a damn?
Yeah. Do I care about you or not? And then I'm going to base that solely on what your job title is. So make it good.
Yeah, because it don't matter if you make six figures if you're a trash man. You know, you got to be something we care about.
Right. It's the title. Does
Right.
the title speak value or
Right.
not?
So have this title be in crippling debt and owe everybody and make less than take home 35K. You got the
Right.
title. That's all that matters.
Right.
With no wealth or assets, none of that. You can't even muhaha correctly. So go be great.
Right. If you're the vice president of distribution management and you make six figures, which means that you pick up trash every day, I'm okay because I can use your title.
Distribution management. Oh my goodness. But yeah, so we'll come back next time we're on and we'll cover that and we will go from there. If there's nothing else, then we'll go ahead and close out the dojo. Thanks again for showing up.
Thank you. And thank you to everybody in the chat for being so engaged. I always like that a lot.
Absolutely. And in the future, don't hesitate to ask questions because, you know, it can spawn ideas for the future and give us an idea of where folks are as far as the barometer goes in the room with regards to all of that. And again, I encourage you to, once it's concluded, if you are on the playback team, definitely go take a look and make some comments and we can go from there. The comment section is always open. I check on that regularly. And I'm always down for having the conversation and extending it, and if need be, bringing it up. And I can even address it on some pre-recorded concepts. So your feedback is appreciated and welcome. But on that note, to the founders of the space, us, to those in the chat, and those who have joined us on the playback, us. This has been the Nameless Protagonist. I appreciate you guys' patience, your time. And remember, ware ware no michi. This is the way. Os.